It's the SNL Hall of Fame podcast with your host, Jamie Dew, Chief Librarian Thomas Senna, and featuring Matt Ardill. And now, curator of the hall, Jamie Dew.
All right. Yes, we are back at the SNL Hall of Fame podcast. Welcome. Please come on inside. But before you do, wipe your feet because we don't want anything scuffing up our beautifully clean marble floors. Now, walk right on past the Weekend Update exhibit into Hall A, where we do all our presentations here on the SNL Hall of Fame. And get ready to have your socks knocked off, because today we've got Andrew Clark joining Thomas in a wonderful conversation on the absolutely fantastic career of Jack Handey. I know most of you are familiar with his work through Deep Thoughts, but there's a lot to unpack with Mr. Handey, and Thomas and Andrew get right into things, and it's really quite wonderful. So I'm glad that we have that to share with you. Of course, we also have our friend Matt Ardill, and let's go to his minutia minute right now. Matt, you can get out of your box now that you've been in for the last week. You can climb out and regale us with all sorts of information on Jack Handey.
Thank you. It's a nice box. It's got nice air holes, so I really do enjoy it in there. Keep it nice and quiet. So Jack Handey, born February 25th, 1949. He is, one of those interesting writers. Very unique history with Saturday Night Live. His first season was season 11, November 9th, 1985. That's the post Dick Ebersol year, where they were sort of recovering. So he started with Joan Cusack and Robert Downey Jr. and Nora Dunn and all of that crew, and continued until season 27 as a writer. He went from probably one of the lowest points in Saturday Night Live history, and I think that's pretty universally considered one of the lower points, to a high point when he left, which was like the Will Ferrell, Rachel Dratch, Anna Gassner kind of era. So he had a really interesting variety there. He's got great sketches like Toonsis the Driving Cat and Frozen Caveman Lawyer, and the one that he's really made his bread and butter on, which is Deep Thoughts. Yes. He's turned that into. He has 11 books. 8 of them are deep thought variations. But people associate that with Saturday Night Live, but it was actually bigger before. It was big before Saturday Night Live. He got his first job writing for Steve Allen. In 1977, he was paid $100 for a joke, and then he started writing with Steve Martin. Martin introduced him to Lorne Michaels, who had him on his. People forget Lorne Michaels actually had other shows back in the day. NBC's The New Show, right? And he also wrote for Bizarre. I don't know if you've ever watched that. I loved that show.
Have.
Kid. Yeah. He had. Boy. Such a great show. You had Super Dave Osborne, Bob Einstein, another Smothers Brothers collaborator along with Steve Martin there. It's just, yeah. He drifted in and out of Saturday Night Live for 17 years, serving as a writer on 178 episodes and a consultant on 20 episodes. Toonsis was actually named after his real-life cat. Yeah. So Toonsis was in multiple sketches, had a half-hour special, Toonsis, the cat who could drive a car. And
Don't recall that.
yeah, it's one of those like one of those little weird projects that Lauren did that people just don't remember because it's such a weird little esoteric thing. And it's interesting. Like he was asked where he came up with the idea for Toonsis, and he's just like, yeah, it's just a free association thing. And he's just like sitting around, and it's like, oh, what's funny? A cat who could drive a car. And what I think is
But not really.
but not really. But he could drive it, but poorly. And Jack, for example, Deep Thoughts was first a segment in Omni magazine. Then it became an article in the National Lampoon, the Santa Fe newspaper. It ran on as an interstitial on Comedy Channel, in all of this before it eventually landed on Saturday Night Live. So he'd already distilled this down into this perfect little like package, and they're just like, okay, well, we'll just add this to the show.
I had no idea.
Yeah, and I mean, what's funny about his stuff is people like think it's like very heady and esoteric, but I mean, look, the caveman lawyer bit. He described it as little boy stuff. Just saying, it's throwaway. When asked about doing topical stuff, he says, I never do that because it's throwaway. You never, there's great jokes that are very timely for like 1978, but nobody wants to read them now. Or 1878. Sorry, that was the quote. But yeah, it's just he's a guy who's like just leaned into the silly, and I think that's what made him able to bounce around and stay funny for so long.
That's really great. Well, thanks so much.
My pleasure.
His voice kind of seeped through for you while watching around that time?
Well, I'm a Jack Handey fan, so that's why. Number one, the one you mentioned it, you can't tell. When Jack Handey has been involved. What's it? Railway malfeasance? Like I can't remember. The title is so absurd. It's like True Trials of Railway Malfeasance, Funball.
Happy Funball,
Frozen Caveman Lawyer, Toonsis the Driving Cat. I mean, they all share the Jack Handey sensibility. So I'm a huge fan of Jack Handey's. I'm a fan of that kind of comedy that doesn't always get through on Saturday Night Live, which is not satire with a capital S. Mm-hmm. So, I have to come clean with that. I am not impartial or going to be so when talking about Jack Handey. I think he's hilariously funny and is probably one of the most imitated, I would say the most imitated writer to have worked on Saturday Night Live. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of people trying to write deep thoughts like Jack Handey and failing. And in fact, it's almost like truffles. They say there's like fake truffles out there. Mm-hmm. There's like fake Jack Handey jokes on the internet that he didn't write. So I think that's a huge credit to him.
Yeah.
I just loved, as soon as, the deep thoughts were on, but a lot of the times you just, when you were watching Toonsis the Driving Cat, you didn't know at the time, oh, that's Jack Handey. It wasn't until the internet allowed you to sort of parse everything that, that you could find all this stuff out, unless you knew somebody.
Sure.
So yeah, I'm an unabashed Jack Handey fan.
And he seems to be the writer from that era that other SNL writers speak of most fondly. I've heard Robert Smigel, I've heard Jim Downey, Conan O'Brien, and Al Franken all say that Jack Handey was the best writer in the room and the funniest guy in the room. And yeah, that just said so much to me right there. I mean, what do you think about that? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that, I would just say, like, we're on this podcast. There's a great interview that Jesse Thorne did with Jack Handey in 2008, which I strongly recommend if people want to know, or if you want to hear it from the Handey's mouth, so to speak. What I would say about him, he's a humorist, and that's often used as an insult. What's a humorist? It's like an unfunny comedian, but he's a humorist in that his work works so well when it's read, when it's in print. Mm-hmm. And he's starting out writing for Army Man magazine and National Lampoon. And I think his first deep thoughts were in like a magazine called Omni, which was a big deal in the 80s. So what I would say, there's a real deadpan to Jack Handey, and all of his characters, whether it's the Jack Handey of Deep Thoughts or Frozen Caveman Lawyer or the railway malfeasance with George Clooney and Mark McKinney, mm-hmm. There's a character who thinks they are normal, who's actually really psychotic.
Yes.
And is completely out to lunch, but thinks they are fine. And I love that. And, there's another writer who's a humorist out there, Mike Sachs. He never worked for Saturday Night Live, but Mike's characters are kind of like that, mm-hmm. too. So I think there's an element there. And I think the other thing, of course, that other writers would like about someone like Jack Handey is they know that Jack Handey's not trying to do what they're doing. Because he's Jack Handey. Mm-hmm. It's like, that's him. He's doing his thing. Like, he's not trying to be Robert Schmeigel or Adam McKay or whatever. He's Jack Handey. So I think writers can sometimes be a somewhat competitive bunch. So when you have someone who's so obviously uniquely a unicorn or themselves, it kind of cools them down because they can be a little bit. Now, I think I've also heard that Jack Handey's a very gracious guy, mm-hmm. and a nice guy and all of that as well, which makes it a little easier to like him, And I think, if you look at his sensibility, he starts out as a newspaper reporter, but his heart is really in humor. And I don't know if people are aware, but his neighbor in Santa Fe at one point was Steve Martin. So he sees Steve Martin on TV and thinks, oh, hey, that's my old neighbor. So he writes and says, can I write for you? And Steve Martin has him, writing for his show. So it's kind of like a weird coincidence that only a Jack Handey character would experience. And then that kind of rolls on. Jack Handey moves to the new show, which was the show Lorne Michaels did after he was let go from Saturday Night Live or whatever, and then he keeps going back. So he's got this interesting, he's almost like a Candide or Zelig, where his career just kind of keeps going forward despite weird, reversals, so to speak, And he has that thing that I think Steve Martin had as well, which is at a time when there's been so much political humor, he's going to do stuff that's really sort of smartly silly, mm-hmm. right? Like smartly silly, absurdist, solipsistic, to throw that word around. And at the time, it was just a perfect way of undermining everything that, had been running through America through the 70s, which is, Watergate, the end of Vietnam, energy crisis, recessions, manufacturing jobs. There's a lot of stuff going on. And so having Steve Martin come out and say, it's great to be here, and then moving over and saying, no, it's actually really great to be here, or having, Jack Handey's Deep Thoughts, for instance.
And now, Deep Thoughts by Jack Handey.
If trees could scream, would we be so cavalier about cutting them down? We might, if they screamed all the time for no good reason.
And I think one of the things I always really loved about the Deep Thoughts was that people thought it was a made-up name.
I did. That was one of my first notes, was I thought Jack Handey was a pen name for the longest time. Because if we're being quite honest, when I started watching SNL, I was 11, around when I started noticing the Deep Thoughts. And in an 11-year-old boy's mind, the name Jack Handey sounds made up. It sounds almost halfway dirty. So I thought that the show had made up this character, which Jack Handey, the character Jack Handey in Deep Thoughts was a character, but I totally thought that was a pen name. So that's funny that you bring that up.
Yeah, and I think that even today, like when he checks into hotels, this is something I remember from the interview with Jesse Thorne. People will say, "Oh, you're Jack Handey. That's the same name as that guy on SNL," and he'll go, "Yeah, I am Jack Handey." They're like,
Yeah. Is there anybody named Jack Handey out in the world? I'm not sure about that.
Well, there was Stuart. I don't know if Stuart Smalley was after Jack.
I think it was
Handey
around the same time.
Around the same time, but there was also Stuart Smalley, which isn't Jack Handey. Stuart Smalley. They're both the same kind of sound, if you will. So you could sort of be forgiven. But no, it was a real person, Jack Handey, and a real big influence. It takes a big man to cry, but it takes a bigger man to laugh at that man. These are, the closest thing you can get is someone like Stephen Wright, right?
Yep.
Right. These are very, very surreal one-liners that kind of take you one way and fold you back. But I would liken them to writing really, really, really good poetry.
Yeah, Jack Handey actually said that his favorite deep thought, because it was so succinct, was...
The crows seem to be calling his name, thought Caw.
That's just the silliest one. But Jack Handey said that, he looked at joke writing. He took pride in using the fewest words to make somebody laugh or to get a joke across. And so that's why he said that was his favorite deep thoughts out of probably the hundreds that he wrote. And 68 of them, I counted, actually appeared on the show, which is amazing, actually. Yeah. I think
at one time he said that, I think he actually said he thought there were almost too many on the show. They'd have like 4, and he was kind of worried about it. But, some of them are, if you go through a lot of hammers each month, I don't think it necessarily means you're a hard worker. It may just mean that you have a lot to learn about proper hammer maintenance. So again, it's funny to say, but he's also an author, right? So he's got a number of books. What I'd Say to the Martians. He had Fuzzy Memories, Deeper Thoughts. So a lot of what he does definitely works in print. And then in the last few years, I guess maybe in the last 10 years or so, he's been writing more for the New Yorker, Shouts and Murmurs. So I see him very much as someone who can survive on writing for television, but also writing in print, which is, interestingly enough, now with the internet, you see the rise of being able to write humor that makes people laugh without an actor doing the material. It's a lot more prevalent now than it was 10 years ago. Things like Reductress and, McSweeney's, of course, have been around forever. But
yeah, before we move on from Deep Thoughts, I want to share a couple of my favorites. So these have been things that have been rattling around my brain since I was a kid, and that's just such a compliment to him. So
I guess of all my uncles, I liked Uncle Caveman the best. We called him Uncle Caveman because he lived in a cave, and because sometimes he'd eat one of us. Later on, we found out he was a bear.
That's such a I could see that actually turning into like an entire sketch on its own. I can see Jack Handey fleshing that out into a sketch. And one that I told my wife when I was explaining Jack Handey to her, I told her about this one.
If you ever fall off the Sears Tower, just go real limp, because maybe you look like a dummy and people will try to catch you, because hey, free dummy.
And I read that one to her, and she was just she just shook her head, and she's like, "That's really funny." And I think his humor just gets nods of appreciation from all walks of life, young people, older people. I think there's such a commonality with Jack Handey's type of humor. I really do. I really think he's the type that brings people together as far comedically.
He uses something that people, I think, forget about sometimes, which is how important surprise is, obviously, in comedy. Because you never can tell where Jack Handey's going. I think in terms of writing, change a word. And I'm not saying, okay, this is to be or not to be, obviously, but change a word. Change because, hey, freedom. If you change those words, you're going to find that you mess with the whole rhythm of it. And it's not going to work as well. So again, I find them deceptive because they seem so simple and they just roll. If you mess with them, you'll see how well honed they are. And in fact, I mentioned Mike Sachs. He has a book, Poking a Dead Frog, which came out a while back with a really good, if I recall, interview with Jack Handey, where he talks about writing. So that's actually a really good book for any sort of aspiring comedy writers, because interviews with comic writers like Meryl Marco, or I even think Conan O'Brien might be in it. And Jack Handey's one of them. And his stuff on how to write and how he writes is really illuminating. So anyone who's sort of interested in it, I would highly recommend.
Was that the same piece? And Jack Handey's probably mentioned this in a few interviews that he's done, but I heard him say that he didn't like when people tried to edit especially like his one-liners or deep thoughts, or like they would try to go in and grammatically change X, Y, and Z, and he said that would bother him because there was a rhythm to how he wrote, and sometimes it didn't have to be grammatically correct. That wasn't the point. The point was the rhythm of what he was writing.
Yeah, that's an issue that you get more in journalism, because you'll get editors. I'm lucky with my column, I don't have that issue, but in other areas, other publications other than, say, the Globe and Mail, where the editor will change your material to make it, not even that it's grammatically incorrect, but to make it sort of go smoother. And it's like, no, that's not going to work. We're writing it this way because ideally it's funnier. And messing with Jack Handey is like taking a paintbrush to Rothko. I mean, it may look, but don't F with it, because you're going to blow it up. The other thing is, if you want to mess with his material, why have him? If you want to get someone who can kind of write Jack Handey kind of funny, you can probably get quite a few people who can kind of be Jack Handey and kind of funny. But if you're going to get Jack Handey, just let him do his thing. And just say, yes, it works, or yes, it doesn't. I think that would be my position with Jack Handey. I don't know what the batting average for the number that he writes versus the ones that he thinks, okay, these are going to work. But, once he's done that, I think you just have to say, then all you can do is say yes or no to the joke. But don't go in and put a comma or change an and to a
that's not the point.
Like
exactly.
Just
so he did almost 70 deep thoughts, or they ran almost 70 deep thoughts on SNL. Fuzzy Memories was 13 times. Lost Deep Thoughts was 11 times. My Big Thick Novel 16 times. And he even did one for good measure, My Best List for 2001. So all in all, almost over 100 times he had segments basically air under his name. I mean, what other writer in the show's history is given that much space and given their own segments like that under the writer's name to do what they want to do? There's Robert Smigel, who did the TV Funhouse, but his name was briefly mentioned. Like, Jack Handey was almost the star of all of these segments, and that's just such a big thing to say about him and his time at SNL, that he was given that much leeway in that playground.
Yeah, and he also, he did have a stint on the Mike Naismith show Television Parts, where he kind of worked on what would eventually be the Deep Thoughts. But I think he's the one and only. I cannot think of anyone else who actually gets their name out there. And it's so ironic that we all thought it was made up.
Exactly. Poor guy. Yeah. So, we attributed it to someone else.
He's the only one, and everyone.
I actually thought it was Al Franken when I was a kid. So I think that was my theory as a teenager before I knew there was an actual Jack Handey. I'm like, oh, Al Franken probably writes these under the pen name Jack Handey. That's before my comedic sensibilities kind of
No, it's a perfectly reasonable assumption. Yeah. Because there's definitely a crossover sensibility. And I think with Jack Handey, he's someone who, he had a novel that he did called The Stench of Honolulu, right? He's kept himself going creatively.
Need parts now? O'ReillyAuto.com offers in-store pickup, same-day home delivery, or next-day home shipping. Get more parts your way at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
It's interesting that that there was never a Tunces movie or a Unfrozen Caveman Lawyer movie, but I guess they were not there. There's even in this SNL lexicon of turning sketches into movies.
Yeah, I think Unfrozen Caveman Lawyer would have been the premise might have been a little as thin as the ice that Key Rock fell through.
Caveman came out of.
Yeah, for sure.
No, I agree.
So I wanted to talk briefly about Fuzzy Memories, because as far as like a follow-up, because we all fell in love with the Deep Thoughts on SNL, but as far as a brief follow-up, Fuzzy Memories I thought was actually really good. I kind of binged all the Fuzzy Memories that I can find and prep for this discussion, and to me they hold up. Maybe some of his later things, but do you have any sort of not so fuzzy memories of Fuzzy Memories?
Well, for me, I would say Scary Neighbor would be one. Fuzzy Memories of the Thanksgiving.
Fuzzy Memories by Jack Handey. I think the best Thanksgiving we ever had was one where we didn't even have a turkey. Mom and Dad sat us kids down and explained that business hadn't been good at Dad's store, so we couldn't afford a turkey. We had vegetables and bread and pie, and it was just fine. Later, I went into Mom and Dad's bedroom to thank them, and I caught them eating a little turkey. I guess that wasn't really the best Thanksgiving.
These kind of weird home movies that he's doing, it's just, it's going a little bit back into the SNL where they would have short films, like, hey, America, show us your gun, like going back to the very first series. So that I think it was a perfect build, and it kind of combined Deep Thoughts with sort of the same sketch sort of mentality as like some of his other stuff, like Happy Fun Ball and those things. There's always a very serious corporate sincerity that's completely misplaced, and a use of corporate language too. Like he likes officious language, like railway malfeasance, or do not use Happy Fun Ball. Do not taunt Happy Fun Ball. If Happy Fun Ball. And I mean, the Fuzzy Memories, I mean, like they have an element of that. Do you have a favorite or two of your own?
Yeah, I love the gallows humor of it all that he pushed even more forward than from Deep Thoughts. So there's one.
When you're 10 years old and a car drives by and splashes a puddle of water all over you, it's hard to decide if you should go to school like that or try to go home and change and probably be late. So while he was trying to decide, I drove by and splashed him again.
It has that turn at the end. Like you're along for the ride, but you're not quite guessing if you hadn't already seen that where it's gonna go at the end. And I know the punchline to that Fuzzy Memories, and it still makes me laugh. Just reading it and watching it again, it still makes me laugh. It's again,
he's the master of the curveball, I think. I mean, and that goes back to this kind of surreal. It follows a real logic, but then that logic goes completely off in the other direction, and you're delighted by when it works, right? And it's just playing with you.
Yeah, and his premises alone would make me laugh. Like just thinking it, like if they didn't even make a sketch on some of his premises, if you just told me that this was an idea by Jack Handey, it would make me laugh. He has this sketch called An Insane Idiot and his collection of descending sized deer heads with Harvey Keitel. And I'm actually gonna kind of break this up for you. I want to play a game with you and based on that sketch. It's two truths and a lie. So I'm gonna give you three statements, and one of which is a lie. And don't worry about your Jack Handey credibility as a fan. We're just having fun over here. So, like I said, Harvey Keitel was in a sketch written by Jack Handey called An Insane Idiot and his collection of descending sized deer heads. So in it, Keitel shows off various sized deer heads mounted on his wall. He also shows off things that are not deer heads. So which of these statements is not true? So Harvey Keitel shows an earthworm with fake horns. Harvey Keitel shows an ant. And Harvey Keitel shows an amoeba under a microscope. Which one of those did he not show?
So an ant.
An ant.
That sounds very Jack Handey, but then an earthworm with horns, that follows in with the deer head thing. So that might be too on the nose.
And then the other one was...
And the last thing is an amoeba.
Under a microscope.
Under glass. I'm going to say ant.
Harvey Keitel actually did not show an earthworm with fake horns. And that was a trick question because he showed a mouse with fake horn. All right.
See, I'm not good at this.
Well, I'll give you credit there. I think
I'm not a good listener.
I think you knew that. And for anybody who's listening who hasn't seen that sketch, I'll say it again. It's called An Insane Idiot and His Collection of Descending Sized Deer Heads. And just reading off the name of that sketch made both Andrew and I chuckle. I think that's a huge...
And it's very Jack Handey because it's a character who thinks that their collection of descending sized deer heads is perfectly acceptable and normal and should not raise any eyebrows, and of course is completely weird and perverse.
Yeah, and it just descends into madness from there for sure. And I was also thinking about Jack Handey's place in SNL history, and I'm wondering if he might be the godfather of the 10-to-1 time slot, because the 10-to-1 time slot's known for the weird sketches and everything, and I seem to remember some of his sketches being placed in that 10-to-1
I think
time
you're
slot.
right. Yeah, I think it's like the same stuff that you might see Will Forte doing. Like, I forget the name of the character at the wedding who talks really low and has the weird hair. And yeah, that sort of 10-to-1 where we're going to put it on. Was Cowbell a 10-to-1?
I forgot.
I kind of like, sort of the weird sketch that no one knows and is anyone watching, so we're going to put it on. I think you could maybe say that he might be the godfather. He might be the trailblazer, the pioneer, if we can still use that term, who stuck a flag in the territory of weird sketches that no one really knows will they work or not. And some of them really work and we remember them, and those that don't, we forget. See, that's one of the great things about sketch comedy and Saturday Night Live. We don't spend an enormous amount of time talking about the stuff at 10-to-1 that didn't fly, although you can sometimes hear some of the cast members talk about like sketches that they did that just bombed, that had done well in Dress or whatever.
Exactly.
I think you could be right. Yeah. And I think he probably liked that. I hear I'm always speaking for these guys.
Well, that's part of
who am I?
That's part of the fun of this. Maybe we could speak for them just a little bit, or try to guess as to their. It's like sports. I watch SNL like I watch sports, and so that's part of the fun of sports is trying to guess of like what the manager's reason was for pulling a pitcher in the ninth and during a no hitter or something like that. I think that's part of the fun of watching SNL.
Absolutely, and I believe that is exactly how it was modeled, like on a baseball team almost, where, people come and go on the Blue Jays or the Yankees, but they're always the Yankees, and that's once they were able to get over the first few casts, then they had set that precedent. So I definitely think that's it. And I think the other thing with Jack Handey is, I think the success of the Deep Thoughts, which I think he had real trouble getting on.
Yeah,
for a
he
while,
did.
Helped maybe other writers who wanted to do stuff that had a similar sensibility. Maybe they had a little bit easier time of it, perhaps.
Yeah, Lorne didn't quite get
success.
Deep Thoughts. Like, I don't think Lorne, that wasn't necessarily totally in his wheelhouse, I believe, but I think he ultimately knew that people found it funny, so he greenlit.
Well, and I would say that as a producer, that's one of his greater strengths, which was, I remember interviewing him. It would have been in 96, and he was talking about a cast members. I think some of them was like Adam Sandler, maybe, I forget, and him saying the network didn't really get them, and they weren't always that popular at the time, and he said, I don't necessarily get it either, but I know it's funny. Mm-hmm. So I think he has that ability to look at something, and whether or not he finds it perfectly to suit his tastes, if he knows it's funny, he'll go with it. In a producer of comedy, a very good asset, because you can meet a lot of, that's not normal. The normal is, well, I don't think it's funny, so it's not funny. Right. Or these kids today, they don't know what they're doing. And I think that one of the things that Lorne Michaels, because I do believe he's a bit of a student of comedy, there's a curiosity there as to what are people laughing at and what's making them laugh.
Right. And we've all benefited from that because, we wouldn't have Jack Handey and Deep Thoughts and all of that. So
that would, I'd like to think that we would, that somewhere that there would be a benevolent God that would allow Jack Handey to be somewhere with his Deep Thoughts.
Exactly. Have you ever had the chance to speak to Jack Handey?
No, but I feel like after this, I should just call him up.
Yeah. Is he...
And say, hey, Jack, what's up?
He seems like I don't know why, but he seems like the type that would like maybe be in the phone book or something. He seems pretty approachable.
I think so. I mean, I think that it's a little disarming, or not disarming. It can be a little alarming when you've got someone who thinks that they know you because they know your work. And again, I don't want to name drop. I remember working with the novelist Martin Amis at Humber, and I said to him, "It must be kind of odd that you meet people who think they kind of know you, and you've just met them." And he said, "Well, actually, they do know me. They read my books. So if they've read my books, they know me." So I hope that's true of Jack Handey, because he would be a very fun person to have a coffee with if that is the case.
Yeah.
I think that someone like Jack Handey would be great for, like, say at Humber, where, teaching comedy. But the one thing you could almost teach is, like, that's Jack Handey. Like, you can't teach that. You can learn from Jack Handey, but you can't learn how to be Jack Handey.
Exactly.
The only thing you can learn from Jack Handey is how important it is to be you.
Yeah.
And I think that's another thing, because a lot of people will dismiss Saturday Night Live, if you will, and say, well, it's a factory. The individual is, kind of wiped out by the bigness of it all, all that kind of thing. And then you look at Jack Handey and say, well, that guy didn't, in any way, shape, or form, I don't believe, change who he was to write on the show.
Yeah.
So he was very uniquely him. Now, if you want to put this in a baseball analogy, because I know Lorne Michaels is a big baseball fan, you can't have a team of Jack Handeys, but you want Jack Handey on your team.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think that's a nice thing. And for someone who's like a print guy like me, I really, really love someone who can kind of live so easily, or at least it appears easy to me, in both worlds.
Yeah. As a fellow print guy myself and a comedy nerd, I think one of my comedy nerd dreams would be to go have coffee with Jack Handey and just laugh and pick his brain. And you know what? I live about an hour from Jack Handey. And
Really?
I do. I live.
Well, geez,
I don't know. Yeah, he lives in
Santa
Santa Fe. If anybody doesn't know, Jack Handey lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And yeah, I live about an hour from Jack Handey. And I've thought a couple of times, like, the times that I've gone up to Santa Fe, like, what if I just ran into Jack Handey and, like, said, hey, let's go grab coffee, or just even talk to him for like 2 minutes or whatever. I've always wanted to run into Jack Handey when I've been up in Santa Fe. So.
Well, again, I'm not trying to encourage anyone to stalk anybody or anything like that. I would say that writers sometimes are occasionally a little bit more approachable, because they aren't under the spotlight, of social media now, for instance, and all that. But I think if you go to a writer like Jack Handey with thoughtful questions about their work, you can generally. And if you're pretty flexible with your timing, you can, you could say, hey, I noticed, in your work, you have these, these themes or these things that reoccur, or, I'm interested. You can get into that. You can get into a conversation.
Yeah, definitely.
So I think you should do it. Life is short.
Yeah, we'll see. Maybe we'll have an addendum to this.
Stalk.
No.
Don't show up with what was it, like with a pumpkin with a knife through its head? Wasn't that one of his things? Like, whenever I feel like killing someone or something, I go to their house and ring the doorbell, and then I'm paraphrasing, and I'm not. I
remember
there,
that one though.
I leave a jack-o'-lantern with a knife through it. Did we talk about this already?
No, but I think that is.
I've been listening and watching a lot of.
Yeah,
Jack Handey.
I think that one.
So they're all melding into one funny, weird, deep.
Yeah,
thought.
so I will not do that. I will not show up to Jack Handey's door with a pumpkin. But sometimes I go to Santa Fe, so it's always just kind of, as a comedy nerd, just that'd be wonderful just to kind of bump into Jack Handey. So.
Again, I think you can never go wrong if you show that you've read their work, you've read all their books, and you have thoughtful questions.
Yeah, definitely.
And you're not a murderer.
That's probably bearing the lead. That's probably the first.
I'm going out on a limb, and I'm assuming you're not.
Correct.
So that's great.
Yeah. Are there any other sketches or anything from before we get out of here that stick out to you with Jack Handey?
Well, I mean, we didn't talk a lot about Toonces, but Toonces the Driving Cat as a concept.
Do you think Toonces will pass his driving test?
I don't know. That written part is pretty hard. And he can't even read.
Maybe he'll make up for it on the driving part.
Damn, I wish I could help him.
All right, sir, if you'll just go ahead and pull out into traffic.
Look out!
has he reached the pedals?
I would have loved to be a fly on the wall, as they say, when that was pitched, just to see the reaction, because it's an extremely funny bit that got used over and over and over again. So, I have a soft spot for Toonces, the driving cat who actually can't drive and constantly gets
That's
in
the best
accidents.
part of the sketch is that Toonces actually is a bad driver. Like Toonces is a great driver for a cat, but ultimately a terrible driver overall. And Jack Handey actually had a cat named Toonces. So that's where that came from.
So that circles the square right there. For obviously, I think a lot of the people who listen to the podcast are obviously pretty familiar, but I definitely would recommend, go take a deep dive into his print, go and see him on the page too, where it's just him right to you. And it's great.
Yeah.
He's great.
Yeah. And as far as his candidacy for the SNL Hall of Fame, specifically, just, brief summary before we head out of here.
The incomparable Jack Handey, who basically created its own form. He brought the epigram, if you will, back. He's got to be one of the most famous writers, as a name. Yeah, we can remember Conan O'Brien. Obviously, they're huge people, but he was the guy who really pioneered, I think, probably some of the most surreal Saturday Night Live stuff that's come. And I think you can credit some of the weird stuff like Cowbell maybe later to having had Jack Handey on the ground doing his thing. He's a locked, guaranteed Hall of Famer for sure.
Yeah, well put. Well, Andrew Clark, thank you so much for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me. This has been super fun.
Oh, yes, Jack Handey, a lock, Andrew Clark says, for the SNL Hall of Fame. Is that going to be the case? We shall see. I don't know that he's the first ballot Hall of Famer based on what I've seen so far in voting, but he would be on my ballot, and he will be on my ballot this year. I think he's a wonderful writer and would be a great addition to the SNL Hall of Fame. Of course, when the time comes to vote, that'll be in your hands. And a voter must receive 66.6% of all, they must appear on 66.6% of all ballots. And if so, they are enshrined in the SNL Hall of Fame. Now, to look back last year at the writing category, it's quite interesting to me because nobody really got any higher than Conan O'Brien. And that makes sense. Conan O'Brien makes sense to garner a lot of votes, but we had a tremendous amount of great writers last year. Oh, my mistake. It was The Lonely Island. The Lonely Island were nominated for writers, and they got 52.9% of the vote. I suspect we'll see them enter this year. From there, Jim Downey got 30.3%, Franklin Davis 29.7%, and Conan O'Brien at 28.4%, Michael O'Donoghue at 25.8%. So all those writers have a long way to go. So for Andrew Clark to suggest that this is a lock, I don't know. I don't know. It will depend upon how the voting body views writing. And I think that writing is really important. The host doesn't have a whole lot to say without writers. The cast, although they contribute ideas and write, they need the writers to shape things into form. So writing is rather important in the world of SNL, and I hope that's reflected in the hall as you all get prepared to vote in season 2. Now, I do need to point out that this year is a little different. You will need to register to vote. So if you have not registered to vote, please do so. You can do so on any of the podcast links that you see access to. Click on it, and one of them is register to vote. And that way we'll be able to send you the ballot when the time comes with the instructions, and Bob's your uncle. What do you say we listen to the curated sketch that was selected for Jack Handey? This is a great one. I remember watching it live and being absolutely blown away. It is somewhat visual. It's It's enhanced with the visual, but the dialogue is great. And that is, of course, the Happy Fun Ball sketch. So let's give that a listen right now before we say goodbye.
It's happy. It's fun. It's Happy Fun Ball.
Yes, it's Happy Fun Ball, the toy sensation that's sweeping the nation. Only $14.95 at participating stores. Get one today.
Warning. Pregnant women, the elderly, and children under 10 should avoid prolonged exposure to Happy Fun Ball. Caution. Happy Fun Ball may suddenly accelerate to dangerous speeds. Happy Fun Ball contains a liquid core which, if exposed due to rupture, should not be touched, inhaled, or looked at. Do not use Happy Fun Ball on concrete. Discontinue use of Happy Fun Ball if any of the following occurs: itching, vertigo, dizziness, tingling in extremities, loss of balance or coordination, slurred speech, temporary blindness, profuse sweating, or heart palpitations. If Happy Fun Ball begins to smoke, get away immediately, seek shelter, and cover head. Happy Fun Ball may stick to certain types of skin. When not in use, Happy Fun Ball should be returned to its special container and kept under refrigeration. Failure to do so relieves the makers of Happy Fun Ball, Wacky Products Incorporated, and its parent company, Global Chemical Unlimited, of any and all liability. Ingredients of Happy Fun Ball include an unknown glowing substance which fell to Earth, presumably from outer space. Happy Fun Ball has been shipped to our troops in Saudi Arabia and is also being dropped by our warplanes on Iraq. Do not taunt Happy Fun Ball. Happy Fun Ball comes with a lifetime guarantee.
Happy Fun Ball. Accept no substitutes.
That is great. That is a tremendous sketch. And it made me laugh as much today as it did when I was, 12 years old listening to that. That's so fun. Do not taunt Happy Fun Ball. That's lovely. And you're lovely as well. Thank you so much for joining us today in the SNL Hall of Fame. We look forward to you visiting with us again next week, when we have another fantastic nominee to unveil for you. In the interim, stay healthy, stay happy, keep watching SNL, and register to vote. But that's it. That's all I got for you right now. But please, on your way out, turn out the lights, because the SNL Hall of Fame is now closed.
Thanks for listening to the SNL Hall of Fame podcast. Make sure to rate, review, share, and subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. Follow us on social media at SNLHOF. This is Doug Denant saying, see you next week.
To podcasts and such.
Stay warm this season with Ariat jackets and vests, available now at Cavender's. Ariat's built for every adventure with cozy warmth and rugged durability. Shop the latest selection of styles for men, women, and kids at your local Cavender's or on Cavenders.com.